intergenerational trauma. You've probably heard of it before, but I'll give you a roundabout definition anyway. Intergenerational trauma is trauma that gets passed down from those who directly experience an incident to subsequent generations. Is it just me, or does this definition seem a little lackluster? How does it get passed down? What can we do about it? Why does it get passed down? And is it only through one big incident or an amalgamation of things? None of these are answered in this definition. What I noticed while researching was that people don't talk about how to work with intergenerational trauma as much as they do with personal trauma. I feel like this is a huge problem, especially in minority populations, where trauma is forced upon them due to oppression and systematic racism, for example, throughout generations. Just because an oppressive structure is removed does not mean that the effects of it are. This is what makes me feel like it's a pressing area of concern in the field of psychology, and I'll be approaching it through a neuroscientific, social, and clinical lens. In this video, I'm going to be telling you all about the biological and social factors involved in intergenerational trauma, and most importantly, talking about how we can treat it. Intergenerational trauma is an amalgamation of everything: our genes, our social environment, our personalities. How we respond to trauma in specific is a key thing. But to break it down, let's start with epigenetics. Epigenetics is a growing field of research in which the environmental effects on gene expression is studied. Experiences can express or suppress gene expression by methyl groups binding to an epigenetic marker. DNA is wrapped around histone proteins. By adding an S-tail group to the tail, this neutralizes the charge and makes the DNA less tightly coiled, also increases gene expression. Adding a methyl group to the tail maintains the positive charge and makes DNA even more coiled and reduces gene expression as a result. Now, how does this come back to intergenerational trauma? Well, an experiment by Merrill et al. In 2020 showed that paternal adverse childhood experiences could predict later health problems in their infant offspring, such as sleep problems and attention problems as a result of DNA methylation changes. The way they did this is with an epigenome-wide association study of blood DNA methylation from 3-month-old infants, then regressing it onto fathers' retrospective adverse childhood experiences at multiple epigenetic markers. Excuse my pronunciation in case it's wrong. Cytosine, phosphate, and guanosine sites to discover associations. I think the study is a really good example for the effects of epigenetics because it allows for distinction between environmental and genetic factors because the DNA methylation is present in the infant at birth, so it doesn't give them time to adopt paternal behaviors by observation. This way, the effects of trauma are passed on to the next generation. And although this study mainly focuses on the physical effects, epigenetics is also related to the passing on of genes involved with generalized anxiety disorder, or otherwise known as GAD. A review by Gottschalk et al. In 2017 found that GAD is a heritable condition with a heritability of 30%. What's interesting is that it was found to be closely related to childhood separation anxiety, social phobia, and panic. All of this cause stress, and stress closely influences epigenetics. This can be passed down generationally. However, most of this, outside of the studies that I've included, has been studied with animal models, and this makes us question their applicability to humans. Nonetheless, it's definitely clear that there's a genetic link to intergenerational trauma. Another factor is the social environment that someone is raised in. Parent trauma or trauma responses will likely be picked up by children, because kids are social learners. They can absorb these cues like sponges, and this links very well to psychodynamic theory and attachment styles. In Isabel et al.'s 2020 study of intergenerational trauma, they explained that any relational trauma experienced by someone can be replicated in their children via attachment styles. This is because of the relational nature of childhood neurobiological development. So what does this really mean? A parent that has had absent parents can replicate that relation with their own children due to the attachment style that they formed as a result. This process then repeats itself throughout generations, creating a timeline of trauma. This, unlike the epigenetics approach, explains intergenerational trauma separate from a singular event. Instead, it is said to be an outcome of traumatic attachment. Psychodynamic theories evoke the importance of childhood experiences in the formation of our attachment styles. This consists of secure, anxious, avoidant, and disorganized. What's important to consider here is that anything that differs from secure is usually seen as a problem. However, According to psychodynamic therapy teachings, Professor Paul Hewitt from UBC being a really good source for this, maladaptive behavior was likely once adaptive as a response to the trauma experienced at the time, usually a defensive coping mechanism that helped them deal with the trauma. Therefore, to really understand attachment styles and intergenerational trauma, the full person must be understood, and this is not made up of a singular event. From their childhood to the current moment, their socio-cultural context, historical context, and anything else, it is all important and likely a key reason as to why the trauma may continue to be passed on through generations. To summarize, one view is that trauma can be a result of a singular event, and it's likely passed on as a result of epigenetics and can not only have emotional or mental effects, but physical ones too. Epigenetics can also be like a mix of tons of different experiences of which affect our epigenetic markers. But the important thing here is stress. Another view takes a more social approach and ties it to learned attachment styles, which contribute to intergenerational trauma continuously. Shore, in a 2009 report, came out with an interdisciplinary perspective, which I found really interesting, focusing on both psychodynamic theory and neuroscience. He studied experience-dependent maturation of the right brain emotional processing in infancy. Now, this, quite obviously, is a key period of emotional development. If trauma is experienced here as a result of parents having unhealthy attachment styles, it will negatively affect the right brain. It triggers a startle reaction in the area, apparently. This activates the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal stress axis, or otherwise known as the HPA, and causes an increase of energy in the autonomic nervous system. This, as we know, results in elevated heart rate, elevated blood pressure, and elevated respiration rates. This all leads to the release of the brain's major stress hormone, corticotropin, otherwise known as CRF. Now, it is not reaching to assume that this cycle may then repeat itself as generations advance. Moreover, stress does not just have emotional impacts but physical ones, as we talked about with the epigenetic changes, and it's linked with predicting many physical health issues. So, after all this doomsday sounding information, is there a bright side? People suffering from intergenerational trauma report feelings of guilt, shame, and confusion when trying to cope with trauma that was not directly experienced. Now, I talk more about that with my personal conversations with friends in the writing section. But this does not make this trauma any less of your own. Moreover, Mendelsohn, 2008, looked at how all of the feelings I talked before, guilt, shame, and confusion, can manifest into something called the heroic dilemma. This is a feeling of pride within the context of one's trauma. Now, it confused me at first because I was like, how is this supposed to be a bad thing? I found that this being a bad thing would be counter-representative. Does this not mean that people are just identifying with their own trauma, that they accept it as their own? I thought it would counter the negative effects of shame. However, after reading into it more, pride in excess can harden maladaptive defensive coping mechanisms and behaviors, which can be very harmful to the self, since it's likely that with these defensive behaviors, one will not accept one's actions as harmful, and this results in a cycle of harm. And in therapeutic processes, there must be a middle ground. So, Isabel et al. Found that prevention is the key intervention. Next would be resolving and understanding trauma and trauma responses. This sounds logical. Find patterns in behavior and work, likely with a professional, to find healthier coping behaviors to prevent transmission of trauma to later generations. Okay, but I do find this to be lacking, mainly because what about the infants that have been biologically affected, whose brains have gone through significant changes early in development, or infants who were born with the physical effects of trauma? It's possible that the same prevention techniques would work, but a question that's still difficult to answer is, to what extent? Epigenetic modification is a likely solution to this, and the good thing about epigenetics is that it's not all bad. Good changes are possible too. If a parent resolves their trauma and sustains good attachment styles, it is then likely, both through epigenetic and attachment style changes, later generations will benefit from this too. So to sum all of this up, if you're suffering from intergenerational trauma, you are heard, you are not selfish or delusional, and you are human. It's beautiful, honestly, how stories and cultures and values and language are passed on from generation to generation. Can it not also be beautiful how stories within us can be passed on without an external input, but from birth? Humans pass their life stories on to another human, and this is not always a negative thing. At the end of the day, it also gives hope for change. You are not your gene expression, and You are not your environment. You're a human who dances with both, who is fluid in both. And intergenerational trauma, it's possible to heal. Thank you for watching this video. I do have an extra section to do with like personal writings, not empirical at all, but just like my conversations with friends and people who have suffered from intergenerational trauma, of course, all acquired with their consent. Thank you for watching.